Something incredible was about to happen to the Airbus A319, which is known as one of the most trustworthy airplanes in the world. Passengers boarded unaware of what was about to happen. Minutes later they encountered an incredible sight and reported the situation to the cabin crew. Passengers got scared during this short journey. Flight 762 British Airways Airbus emergency is based on official accident reports and eyewitness accounts. We go back to a recent date, May 24, 2013, at London Heathrow Airport, one of the busiest airports in the world. The pilots and cabin crew were boarding the plane, operated by British Airways, for the first flight of the day. The clock read 6:30 in the morning. Flight number 762 was preparing to depart for Oslo, the capital of Norway. If we talk a little bit about the plane, the aircraft was an almost 12-year-old Airbus A319 with the tail number Golf Echo Uniform Oscar Echo. This type of aircraft can be imagined as a short version of the A320 series. It is a very useful and reliable aircraft for short-leg flights. In the cockpit, the 50-year-old captain of the flight had 12,500 hours of flight experience. The experienced captain had worked for British Airways for his entire career, had flown half of his total flight hours in this type of aircraft, and was a pilot who was very familiar with the aircraft. The co-pilot was almost as experienced as an average captain pilot, with 5,400 hours of flight experience in the right seat. What the experienced co-pilot would miss that morning would have huge consequences. 75 passengers boarded the plane. A total of 80 people, including 5 flight crew members, had taken their seats for this short 2-hour flight. Completely unaware of the emergency they were about to experience, the pilots reviewed the aircraft's past technical log minutes earlier. While the captain pilot was in the cockpit preparing the aircraft for taxiing, the co-pilot was doing the external checks of the aircraft. In airlines, co-pilots mostly do the external checks while the captain pilot completes the in-cockpit checks. While the co-pilot was doing the external checks, did not notice anything out of the ordinary. The problem missed by the experienced co-pilot would cause them a big issue later in the flight. The captain pilot entered the route and fuel calculations into the flight management system at that time. This fancy system is used in modern planes to figure out how the plane should fly and how much fuel it should use. After completing the final checks, the pushback vehicle started pushing the aircraft backwards 15 minutes before takeoff. Normally, before departure, one of the ground handlers performs the final checks by turning around the aircraft counterclockwise to determine whether there is anything missing. But just like the co-pilot, the ground crew failed to realize the cause of the emergency they were about to experience. Let's take a quick break. We've put a lot of effort into this video, so if you find it informative, please remember to subscribe and like. Your support allows us to create more content for you. The pilots began taxiing to head the aircraft to the runway. The co-pilot in the right seat would be the pilot flying of the flight, with the captain pilot working as the pilot monitoring. At 8:15 p.m., they received clearance to line up and departure for runway 27 and lined up at the beginning of runway 27. The co-pilot opened the throttle levers of both engines fully. As the airplane started to accelerate on the runway, the passengers sitting by the window were suddenly faced with an incredible scene. The passengers observed that an important component of the airplane, the engine cowling doors, the covers outside the engines, had opened. Made of strong lightweight materials such as aluminum, titanium, and composite components. These covers protect the aircraft engines from external factors and increase the aerodynamic performance of the aircraft. The engine cowling doors were swinging up and down on the engines due to the power given to the engines for takeoff and the severe weather caused by the aircraft increasing speed on the runway. Unable to resist any longer, the doors snapped off with great violence and crashed onto the asphalt runway and away from the aircraft. The pilots, unaware of the incident, lifted the plane's wheels off the runway and began climbing. They were following a specific chart and plan for taking off, especially since they were doing an instrument takeoff. The passengers who witnessed what happened reported to the cabin crew in a panic that the engine cowling doors had broken off. The cabin crew immediately reached for the interphone to contact the captains. The cabin crew tried to contact the captains but failed. The captain pilot ignored the crew's call as they were in the takeoff phase, one of the most important phases of the flight. He was concentrating on following the route of the aircraft. Meanwhile, another traffic waiting for takeoff noticed 2 engine doors detached from the aircraft and immediately reported the situation to the tower. After they reported foreign objects on the runway, the pilots on the British Airways A319 also noticed the conversations between the aircraft on the ground and the tower. They realized the situation they were in. The captain first continued to climb to 1,100 feet to bring the aircraft to a safety altitude of plus 400 feet. The crew put the aircraft on autopilot, but within seconds the auto thrust, which automatically adjusted adjust the power turned off and the master caution system was activated. From this moment on, the pilots were manually controlling the throttle levers of the airplane. Both engines were operating adequately and producing power, even though the engine cowling doors were detached. Therefore, due to the instrument takeoff procedure I just mentioned, the pilots continued to climb the airplane to 6,000 feet in the planned direction. The aircraft's electronic monitor, called ECM, displayed a loss of engine pressure warning for engine number 2, the right engine. ECM can simply be described as the screen on which the problem is reported directly to the pilots in case of a technical malfunction in the aircraft. The aircraft, which lost power in the right engine, also faced hydraulic failure within seconds. They would no longer be able to use some of their flight surfaces. These flight surfaces included the spoiler and reverse thrust system, which allowed them to slow down. The pilots had to turn back and land as soon as possible in order not to lose almost all of the hydraulics in case they lost their other engines. The electronic display shows the malfunctions as well as the instructions that the pilots should follow immediately after the malfunction. The captain disabled the power transfer unit in accordance with the instructions on the screen. By this time, the aircraft had completed the climb and had reached 6,000 feet. As they were flying at more than 450 kilometers per hour, the airflow outside was damaging the engines with every second. The pilots, who were switched to the radar frequency after takeoff, reported pan to the air traffic controller, which is the urgency call code. They reported that they had an engine problem and consequently lost the hydraulic system. They reported that they would return to Heathrow and requested a vector for the return. The controller said they would be directed to turn the plane back to Heathrow. Within seconds, fuel started leaking from the right engine. The photos on the screen were captured on the cameras of some of the passengers on board at the time. After checking the engines again, the cabin attendant informed the captains in the cockpit that the top of the right engine looked like it had exploded and that the left engine had no cowling door. After analyzing the situation, the pilots talked among themselves about landing on runway 27 right. But within seconds, a fuel imbalance warning was activated on the electronic monitor. The co-pilot easily detected the fuel leak immediately after the warning. The pilots were rapidly approaching runway 27, less than 10 miles, 18 kilometers from the runway. The right engine fire warning sounded. As soon as the captain pilot received the warning, he directly shut down the right engine without getting the co-pilot's approval. He activated one of the fire extinguishers, but the engine was still on fire and the fire warning remained active. The seriousness of the incident had increased with the fire. Although the pilots initially reported the pan emergency code to the tower, they cancelled it. Because of the fire, the captain gave the Mayday report, which is even more serious. In the meantime, they were disconnected from the autopilot and the co-pilot was continuing the manual approach. The situation was getting more serious than they thought. They lowered the landing gear and aligned with the runway. Although the pilot flying was the co-pilot at the beginning of the flight, the captain pilot took control of the plane about 500 feet and 2 kilometers before landing. Even though there was a fire in the right engine, they were descending while using their only remaining engine. While the captain was descending by visually, the co-pilot was telling the captain their current speed and altitude. In case of a failed landing, it was obvious that the emergency situation would get much worse if they had to pass. The pressure increased on the captain. He had to land the plane with one engine remaining in one attempt. Fortunately, the experienced captain was able to put the wheels of the plane on the runway within seconds. Due to the loss of some of their hydraulics, their spoilers and reverse thrust, which are systems that help them slow down, did not work. Therefore, their stopping distances increased. The flight crew performed a successful landing and emergency procedure. During the landing, the tower controller informed the pilots that flames were seen in the right engine. The airport fire truck immediately came to the aircraft and extinguished the fire in the flaming engine. There were no fatalities or injuries in the incident. Passengers were evacuated in a short time using the slides on the left door. Today, airplanes are designed to be able to fly with a single engine when they lose one of their two engines, as the captain just did. This is one of the purposes of having dual engines on this type of passenger aircraft. It is almost impossible to lose both engines on a passenger aircraft. The loss of one engine was not normally such a big problem. The main reason for the panic in this incident was the possibility of the pilots losing both engines. So what was the reason for the engine cowling doors coming off and breaking off during the takeoff run? Coincidentally, they noticed that a ground handling staff member was recording the preparation of the aircraft for flight in order to make a training video that day. The problem was already evident from the photos and videos they had. In the video taken by the crew, they noticed that both engine doors were open before the flight. From the gap in the photo on the screen, it is clear that the cowlings were not fully closed. The co-pilot did not notice this situation while performing external checks before the flight. The training given to the pilots includes a detailed check of the engine surface before the flight. but the co-pilot told the authorities that he did not notice the situation while performing the external checks. The inspectors thought that the co-pilot had not performed the external checks in accordance with the procedure specified in the operational manual and had checked the aircraft in a sloppy manner. In addition, during the pushback, the ground handler also failed to notice that the engine covers were open. Immediately after takeoff, passengers noticed the fuel leakage and told the cabin crew, but this information did not reach the pilots immediately, and the pilots became aware of the situation later. So who was really responsible for this incident? Was it the co-pilot or the ground handler? The answer is either. Following maintenance on the aircraft during the night before the flight, the technicians had delivered the aircraft without closing the engine covers. The open engine cover hit a pipe carrying fuel in the right engine and caused a fuel leak. The leaking fuel caught fire as they closed in for landing and caused a fire in the right engine. The final report stated that the technicians were the ones primarily responsible for the incident. They found out that the maintenance manual procedures were not followed during maintenance, and therefore the doors were left open. After the incident, both technicians and pilots were obliged to check that the colored markings on the engine covers matched each other. As for what happened to the aircraft, the Airbus A319, which experienced an engine fire, has been repaired and is still operating under British Airways today with its new engines.